most memorable events for everybody has got to be September 11th. And, you know, I remember exactly where I was and when I heard about it, and that, I think, in the life of practically most Americans, that would be the most memorable event for the nation anyway.
Well, like 9/11 was like the biggest event that impacted our country, and not just our country, other countries as well, as far as the impact of terrorism on countries. That's the one that stands out in my mind. That one made a difference.
I remember hearing about it, and I remember that day, how that day went in a somber kind of tone and a sadness. And
had one of those moments where like you're living it, but you're also realizing it's something you'll remember where you were for the rest of your life.
September 11th, 2001 that was the day that my age, people in my generation in high school suddenly gave a damn. Because before that it had been just kind of like, yeah, America, woo. And suddenly people were attacking us. This isn't the first time that the trade towers had been attacked. There had been a truck with explosives in it that did a little bit of damage and hurt some people. But compared to the mass destruction that occurred later was largely ineffectual. But I remember waking up one morning and my mom saying, "You're not going to school today."
And we just turning on the TV, and the first tower was on fire. On the TV, the second plane hit. At first I thought it was just a recording of what happened to the first one, but then you realized, you know, that was actually live. So I saw the second plane hit into it. You know, so I pretty much remember that day, especially in the morning, pretty vividly, going, you know, listening to when Howard Stern was on the terrestrial radio, listening to him because he was broadcasting it, you know, how everything was unfolding all the time as I was going to the doctor.
I was coming to work here at Monte Vista and taught first period, and kids were starting to come into class saying that that 2 buildings fell down, and I thought they were exaggerating, and I was trying to calm them down. I said, "No, that's not true. 1 plane crashed." And they're like, "No, 2 planes crashed and the building fell down." I said, "Oh," I was like, "Stop it, you guys, you're just exaggerating," because I didn't see that part of it. And then as the day progressed, of course, we all found out that it did. In fact, they did fall down, and there were 2 planes, and that was a really shocking day for everyone.
Obviously led to like the Iraq War, and something that we're still in today. It's just led to this whole huge fiasco. A lot of problems stem from that, so like that was the big one.
Discrimination against Muslims like almost immediately became horrible. I think before that people were like, "Oh yeah, Muslims exist," and that was about it. And suddenly it was like, "Oh well, Muslims."
It made changes, but like security.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot more security nowadays than there used to be.
The way we travel is really different now than it was prior to those attacks. I mean, my dad used to travel a ton for work when I was really young and before I was born, and so like definitely like whenever I travel with him, just hearing how all the things have changed and there's so much more security.
I think that kind of changed everything, not just locally. Obviously, security measures everywhere are completely different because of that. Like airports and just sporting events where just everything's tight.
The level of like merging between technology and humans have just become like.
The technology is impressive. It is all new, and a lot of it is beyond my capability. I'm 90 years old, and I have a flip phone instead of a Apple.
we got computers, and laptops, social media. We didn't have that when I was a kid.
The explosion and the household use of the internet was probably even bigger than that. Now it's like the phone has like become part of us. It's like jumped into our pockets all the time.
Instant connectivity has had a tremendous impact on our world. So I see those 2 decades as being the key ones that I've experienced in my life.
They started out big, they got small, and then because people wanted screens, they went a little bigger again. So it was kind of like this weird movement. So I saw them mainly when they were like when everyone wanted the smallest one possible. So we had like these like tiny little like rectangles, you know, because the screen wasn't important. It was still, a phone was for speaking. Now no one really even talks. Like a phone's not even for like talking on it anymore, right? It's this screen. It's 100% visual.
And it's going to change even more. And your tech now, just in another 20 years, it'll be unbelievable.
More likely that the people growing up with this will just have the texting instead of the in-person communication. I think what you get used to is what you get used to. So if you grew up being more in person to person, it's unlikely that a phone is going to switch your entire way you communicate with somebody, because you kind of create sort of a pattern for yourself that you're used to. Just become like before you would have like, you could have a computer, you have a TV, you'd have a phone, but they would be like things you would use once in a while, right? And you probably didn't have your phone on you all the time. Like it would just be like, oh, it's at my house or whatever, and people wouldn't think anything of it. Now it's like the phone is like become part of us. It's like jumped into our pockets all the time, and it's like connected to us.
Now, of course, we're all living with the effects, and again, it has this feeling of normalcy. We've always had smartphones, we've always had the internet, you know, but we really haven't. The change has come, well, really not gradually. When you look at total human history, it's come very quickly, but to an individual, it's come day to day, and we just kind of accept things the way that they are right now. For example, when you came up, I was just working on the computer, and you know, it was just normal stuff. Wow, 20 years ago doing that, I guess I would have had a computer, but it would have been a big clunky thing with 2 floppy disks that held 256K of memory each, and so now normalcy, you know, we thought of normalcy back then, but it just didn't include all the stuff that we have right now. So how have we changed? Terrifically.
That the internet has like changed things, and smartphones, the ability to text someone without, you know, you don't have to like type out a whole message, and we don't have to handwrite letters. Hardly anybody does that anymore. Yes, I think there's both, again, positive and negatives to that, because sometimes an email or a text is hard to read what someone is trying to say, like their emotions or their intent behind a message. It can be misunderstood more easily.
And it's been this gradual increase in the social effects of technology. So like,
and it kind of encourages people to talk to people outside of just their tight-knit communities. My generation really has the luxury of, like, if you have a question, you have all the tools to try to answer it immediately. You don't really have to wait. There isn't really this like research period or this downtime between when you have an idea and when you can kind of check on whether it's something you can make a reality. It's just, a lot of it's really instantaneous, and I think that's made a huge difference.
Wars cause progress. They cause a lot of misery. Just think of the millions of people that were killed in the wars. That's terrible. It really is awful. But technology advanced a lot during the wars. But that's you can't trade human lives for technology. Different thing. The most significant events in my life have been the wars. Took away my father and separated me from my wife while we were fighting in Korea and things like that.
I was drafted 3 times during the Vietnam War and managed to avoid the draft all 3 times. Last time I avoided the draft by joining the Air Force Reserve, which put me in the military and showed me peripherally what was happening to other people during the war.
It's not fair that you don't have classes for blacks. You don't talk about black history. You don't talk about Hispanic history. You don't talk about women's history. You just talk about white men's history. So we would protest. We would demonstrate for that.
So the civil rights movement was really what I would call the template for all the resistance movements that came after. Resistance to the Vietnam War, resistance to corporate structure, for example. If you can remember, if you've seen movies from the 50s, men that were displayed going to work always had a white shirt and a tie on, a suit coat, right? So a lot of the resistance, the social resistance from the baby boomers that I was a part of, had to do with not doing it like your parents did. So the civil rights movement was sort of a template for that. It was a template for the women's movement. It was a template for the anti-war movement. It was a template for a lot of things that occurred after that, in terms of changing the way society was run and built. The assassination of JFK was huge, right? I mean, I can remember where I was. I can remember what I was doing. I can remember who I was with. That very moment when you found out about that, when I found out about that, it was devastating because he was a war hero. He was a great president. My parents loved him, and it was just a horrible, horrible situation. And then you have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and you have the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was a turbulent, difficult time. You thought society was falling apart, and it was scary.
And then in the 80s, 81, President Reagan was shot. He wasn't killed, but he was shot. So, and John Lennon of the Beatles was shot and killed. So it was happening. It was a lot of that happening. And now we don't see that so much. And I don't know if there's more security or what, but that's a lot. In the 67 to 71, I was at Berkeley. So there was a lot of turmoil around the Vietnam War, and also about other kind of rights, not just rights for African Americans, but there were certain classes we wanted at school that there weren't being offered, and there was land that university was like the students were using as a park in the university. Almost like every quarter there was a different issue that it'd be the Vietnam War, and there would be Chicano studies, there were black studies or women's studies, or because those things weren't being offered. The free speech movement happened at Berkeley just before I got there. So it was just sort of opening that door. At one point, there were these police cars. They would have like 4 big policemen in overalls, blue overalls, and they would sometimes they'd drive down the street and there would just be tear gas coming out of their car, like they would just spew it in the streets. And then once in a while they would jump out and run after somebody and grab them and take them and arrest them. So it was a scary place to be.
Those 20 years, there have been situations where I have seen prejudice, and I think that never goes away. So I think that in terms of civil rights and equal protection, there has to be a constant, never-ending effort to make it better. I don't think that's ever going to go away.
But what I didn't hear was you can do anything you want, but only if you work for it. And I coasted, and that was the message. That's what psychologists were saying. Like makes for great child development is reinforce your children's self-esteem. Tell them they can do anything, and they will be able to because they'll feel good enough about themselves. They'll have the confidence. And so what I see a lot today with younger generations is parenting that more follows a mantra of work, and that's it. Just work. And it's kind of weird. On the one hand, I can look back at my life, which hasn't been actually that long so far, and say, okay, well, I should have worked harder in certain areas. All right, and so then it feels good to see you guys working and being more proactive. That's awesome. One of the greatest predictors of college success is conscientiousness, not SAT scores. SAT scores are great, and those will get you into college, but after you're there, you need to be conscientious.
I think the 2 presidential elections were pretty notable. I think, unfortunately, there have been other terrorist attacks that have taken place in Europe and other parts of the world that I think have kind of, as a culmination, maybe not any single event, but as a whole, the fact that that's almost expected that every few years something like that is going to happen is unfortunately just something I think my generation is starting to get used to.
We're getting pretty good with the gay rights thing. I think depending where you go, like there's certain little pockets in the U.S. that probably are not that great, but like I think overall the gay rights thing has been pretty good. It's catching up. There was a short period where everyone was like super patriotic, like American flags everywhere. It was like, yeah, America, all together. That kind of faded a little bit over time.
Marriage equality earlier, but I've definitely, in my own personal life in the last couple of years, definitely been hearing more in the news and just pop culture. I listen to a lot of podcasts, so a lot more talk about like women's rights and the wage gap is definitely a big thing that comes up a lot in the news, and just a general conversation about getting more women involved in kind of in technology roles, so like getting more women in engineering, getting more girls to do that type of thing for their career, and then also having more women leaders, more women CEOs. There's a big push for that I don't think I necessarily felt as much when I was younger, but I think more recently, especially with like how much communication there is on the internet and social media, there's definitely been a lot of highlight on that. So I think that'll be a trend in the next few years coming up. Open expectation is that things will always continue to get better, and that more people will have access to basic needs, and more people will just have a good quality of life and a good standard of living that they can hope to achieve. So I think things are getting better, but sometimes day to day or from one year to the next, it definitely feels like maybe we're taking a step backwards, but that doesn't mean we're not headed in the right direction.
It would be the internet and the rise of like the technology in terms of smartphones, and just the ability to have so it was kind of like the combination of the internet and making it portable and accessible all the time with the smartphone, like that together. It's created a pretty major impact and change on the way people just sort of function on a day-to-day basis.
It was a simpler life. It really was. Now we're overcome with communications. There's too much.
Days for, I don't know, 100,000 years of civilization. There were probably always the good old days. I don't really yearn for the good old days, to tell you the truth. Sure, I had some good times back then, but with connectivity and information and things like that, the way they are now, being able to contact other groups, being able to just discuss things with people across the country, and just seeing ideas from places that I never would have seen ideas from 5 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I think we're better off now.
So I worry about greed. America's kind of got a greed thing going. I think that's kind of dangerous, can be dangerous.
I think if you step back and look at it in a much larger picture, I think it's positive, right? A lot of people will say it's negative because of this whole Trump thing, but I think that's looking at it like too much, too like close, like you're too zoomed in. If you like kind of zoom out, I think just everything's getting better.